Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Born beneath the factory sky. Childhood and family life in Victorian England. There is no quiet room, no antiseptic air, no gentle lighting. Birth happens where life already is, often in a single rented room shared by parents, siblings, perhaps a lodger, and sometimes the tools of work itself. The air smells faintly of coal smoke, boiled water, damp wool, and whatever refuse the street outside has offered up that day. If you are born in London, Manchester, Birmingham, or Leeds, the sound of industry hums continuously through the walls. Carts rattling, steam engines exhaling, factory whistles marking hours that matter far more to employers than to families. Your mother may be attended by a midwife, an experienced local woman rather than a trained professional. Formal medical training for childbirth exists, but it is expensive and often distrusted. Doctors are called only when something has gone wrong, and by then it is often too late. Pain relief is minimal or non-existent. Chloroform is known but controversial, and for working-class women, rarely available. Birth is endured, not managed. If you survive the first hours, you are already among the fortunate. Infant mortality in Victorian England is high, devastatingly so. In many industrial cities, 1 in 4 children dies before their first birthday. Diarrhea, respiratory infections, measles, scarlet fever, and simple dehydration lives quietly and relentlessly. Clean water is unreliable. Milk is often watered down or contaminated. There is no understanding of germs, only vague notions of bad air or divine will. Your parents know this. They have likely buried children before. Because of this ever-present risk, emotional attachment in infancy is cautious. You are loved, certainly, but love is tempered by experience. Nomming may be delayed. Celebrations are modest. Survival comes first. Sentiment follows later if it is allowed to grow at all. You are wrapped tightly, swaddled to keep you warm in a home where drafts slip easily through thin walls and poorly fitted windows. Coal is expensive. Heat is rationed. In winter, frost can form on the inside of glass panes. Your mother's body provides warmth more reliably than the hearth. If you are born into a working-class family, your father's income is uncertain. Wages fluctuate. Work may vanish without notice. Injury can mean starvation. There is no safety net beyond charity, family, or the parish poorhouse, places people fear nearly as much as hunger itself. Meals are simple, repetitive, and filling when possible. Bread is the foundation of survival. Dripping rendered fat is prized. Meat is rare. Vegetables are seasonal and often overcooked. For infants, breast milk is ideal but not always possible. If your mother must return to work quickly, you may be fed pap bread soaked in water or milk. It fills the stomach but offers little nourishment. Space is scarce. Privacy is non-existent. You learn early to sleep through noise. Crying is discouraged not out of cruelty but necessity. Noise attracts attention. Attention can lead to trouble. Complaints from neighbors, visits from landlords, or worse, scrutiny from authorities concerned with neglect. A word applied unevenly and often unfairly to the poor. If you are born into a middle-class home, your surroundings differ but not as much as you might expect. Space is greater. Food is more reliable. There may be a separate nursery. A servant or nursemaid might help care for you. Yet fear still shadows childhood. Disease does not respect class boundaries. Middle-class families also lose children, and grief settles into households regardless of income. Your mother's role is rigidly defined. She is expected to be endlessly patient, morally upright, and self-sacrificing. Motherhood is praised in theory and exhausting in practice. Large families are common, partly by choice, partly by lack of effective contraception. Pregnancy follows pregnancy, and women age quickly under the strain. Your father's presence may be limited. Long work hours mean he leaves before dawn and returns after dark. Children often know their fathers more as authority figures than companions. Discipline is strict, sometimes harsh. Physical punishment is widely accepted, seen as a necessary tool to prepare children for a world that offers little mercy. By the time you can walk, you are already absorbing the rhythms of survival. You learn where not to step, what not to touch, when to be silent. Streets are dangerous places. Horses, carts, open drains, and unguarded machinery present constant risks. Children die from accidents as often as from illness. Play exists, but it is improvised. Toys are rare. Games are made from scraps, hoops rolled with sticks, bits of string, chalk on stone. Play happens in alleys, yards, or wherever adults are not actively working. Childhood is brief, informal, and largely unsentimental. Education is not yet compulsory for much of the Victorian period. If you attend school, it may be irregular, crowded, and focused more on discipline than curiosity. If money is tight, and it usually is, you may be pulled out to work. Even very young children contribute, minding siblings, running errands, carrying water, or assisting in home-based trades. From the beginning, your value is practical. Your life is measured less by age than by usefulness. Survival depends on cooperation within the family. Every pair of hands matters. Affection exists, but it is expressed quietly, often through acts rather than words. And always, hovering just beyond the cradle, is the question your parents do not speak aloud but feel every day. Will you live long enough to matter? As you grow, the world will demand more from you: more labor, more endurance, more acceptance of conditions you did not choose. But for now, in these earliest days, existence itself is the achievement. Each breath is tentative. Each sunrise is uncertain. You are here, but for how long and at what cost remains unknown. If you survive early childhood, you slowly cross an invisible threshold. There is no ceremony to mark it, no clear moment when infancy ends and usefulness begins. It happens gradually, through expectation rather than announcement. One day, you are no longer simply watched, you are given something to do. A small task at first, holding a baby while your mother scrubs clothes, carrying coal scuttles that are almost too heavy, fetching water from a pump several streets away. These errands are not framed as lessons. They are necessities. In Victorian England, childhood is not understood as a protected stage of life. It is a preparation period, brief and practical, meant to harden you against what lies ahead. Adults assume you will need resilience more than imagination, obedience more than curiosity, strength more than comfort. Home life revolves around work, even when work is not formally paid. In many households, labor spills into the living space. Piecework sewing, finishing garments, assembling small items is done at the table where meals are eaten. The clatter of tools becomes background noise to daily life. You learn to navigate needles, blades, and hot irons early, because avoiding them is impossible. Family relationships are shaped by this shared strain. Affection exists, but it competes with fatigue. Parents are often exhausted. Mothers, in particular, carry an immense burden, managing the household, caring for children, sometimes earning income, and doing all of this with limited resources and little social support. Emotional warmth may appear inconsistent, not because it is absent, but because there is little energy left once survival tasks are complete. Discipline remains strict. Children are expected to be quiet, attentive, and compliant. Disobedience is seen not as a developmental phase, but as a threat to order, to reputation, to the fragile balance that keeps the household afloat. Corporal punishment is common and socially accepted. It is framed as moral instruction, a way to prepare children for a harsh world by introducing them to consequences early. As you grow, your awareness of class sharpens. You understand where you stand by what you wear, where you go, and how others address you. Clothing is practical and often second-hand. Shoes are precious and repaired repeatedly. Going barefoot is common, even in cold weather. Cleanliness is valued but difficult to maintain. Water must be carried. Soap costs money. Dirt becomes an accepted companion. If you attend school, it is likely a charity school, Sunday school, or a factory school attached to your parents' place of work. Instruction is basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction. Memorization is favored over understanding. Classrooms are crowded. Discipline is enforced with rulers, canes, and public humiliation. Education is not universally trusted. Some parents fear that schooling makes children above their station or less willing to work. Others value it deeply but cannot afford the lost wages that come with attendance. Your schooling may be interrupted repeatedly by illness, seasonal work, or family crises. By the age of 7 or 8, many children are already working in some capacity. Not all labor takes place in factories. You might work in agriculture, as a domestic servant in small workshops, or as a street seller. Jobs are informal and poorly regulated. Pay is minimal, hours are long, and safety is rarely considered. Factory work, when it comes, is relentless. The noise is constant. The air is thick with dust, fibers, or chemical fumes. Machines are unguarded. Injuries are common and often permanent. Children are valued because they are small, quick, and inexpensive. They crawl beneath machinery, clean moving parts, and perform repetitive tasks for hours at a time. At home, family dynamics shift as children begin contributing wages. Authority becomes entangled with economics. A child who brings home money gains a certain weight in household decisions, even while remaining subject to parental control. Pride and pressure mix uneasily. Parents rely on their children's income while also fearing for their safety. Meals remain simple. Hunger is familiar. Growth is often stunted. Many children suffer from rickets caused by poor nutrition and lack of sunlight. Tuberculosis lurks everywhere, slow and consuming. Illness is managed with home remedies, rest if possible, and resignation when necessary. Doctors are expensive and sometimes ineffective. Death, when it comes, is mourned quietly and absorbed into daily life. Despite this, moments of connection persist. Siblings form tight bonds, sharing beds, clothes, and secrets. Older children care for younger ones, sometimes more consistently than parents can. These relationships are practical but also deeply emotional. Loyalty is forged through shared hardship. Leisure is limited but not absent. Sundays offer a pause. Church attendance provides structure, routine, and sometimes warmth. Religious instruction emphasizes obedience, patience, and hope for reward beyond this life. Hymns are memorized. Sermons are endured. Faith becomes another tool for making sense of suffering. Festivals and holidays exist, though modestly. A rare treat, a sweet, a toy, a fair can linger in memory for years. These small pleasures stand out sharply against the monotony of work and routine. As adolescence approaches, expectations harden. Childhood ends not with celebration but with increased responsibility. You are expected to endure longer hours, heavier labor, and stricter standards. Dreams, if they exist, are practical. Steady work, survival, perhaps a slightly better life than your parents had. Marriage looms early, especially for girls. By their mid-teens, many are already working as servants or factory operatives, saving what they can. Courtship is brief and pragmatic. Love is considered desirable but secondary to stability. Families weigh prospects carefully, knowing that a poor match can mean lifelong hardship. Throughout all of this, the city presses in. Smoke darkens the sky. Soot settles on windowsills. Streets are crowded and loud. Nature is distant, glimpsed only in small parks or on rare trips to the countryside. Your world is built of brick, iron, and human labor. You adapt because you must. Resilience is not celebrated, it is assumed. Complaints are seen as weakness. Endurance becomes a quiet virtue, passed down through example rather than instruction. By the time you near adulthood, you have already lived a life dense with effort. You have learned how fragile stability is, how quickly illness or unemployment can undo years of work. You have seen neighbors disappear into workhouses, hospitals, prisons, or graves. And as you stand on the edge of adulthood, contributing fully, expected to carry your share of the burden. A question begins to form, not yet spoken, but deeply felt. Is this the life you will now repeat, until age or illness finally forces you to stop? Adulthood in Victorian England does not arrive with clarity. There is no single day when you are declared grown. Instead, responsibility accumulates until it becomes indistinguishable from identity. By your late teens or early 20s, often earlier, you are simply expected to endure without question. What once felt heavy now feels normal, not because it is light, but because you have carried it for so long. If you are a man, steady work is the measure of worth. Employment defines your place in the world and your value within the family. Long hours are expected. Exhaustion is assumed. Injury is feared but tolerated as an occupational hazard. If you can still work, you are considered capable. If you cannot, explanations matter little. If you are a woman, marriage is both an expectation and a risk. It may offer stability, or it may bind you to a life even harder than the one you came from. Love is desirable but not guaranteed. Practical considerations dominate: wages, sobriety, reputation. A husband's character can determine whether life becomes manageable or unbearable. Marriage is rarely private. Crowded housing means newlyweds often live with relatives or take in lodgers to afford rent. Privacy remains a luxury. Children arrive quickly and frequently. Contraception exists in limited forms but is unreliable, poorly understood, and socially frowned upon. Motherhood becomes a near-constant state. For women, labor does not end with marriage. Paid work may continue, especially in working-class households. If not, unpaid labor expands: cooking, cleaning, childcare, managing scarce resources. Pregnancy and childbirth take their toll. Maternal mortality remains high. Many women die young, worn down by repeated pregnancies, malnutrition, and untreated complications. Family life revolves around survival. Children are raised with the same expectations you once faced. You teach them caution, obedience, usefulness. Affection is present but restrained, shaped by the knowledge that sentiment cannot shield them from the world. You hope they will fare better, but you prepare them for the likelihood that they will not. Illness becomes more frequent as years pass. Industrial work damages lungs, joints, and hearing. Tuberculosis remains common. Rheumatism, chronic pain, and respiratory disease are constant companions. Medical care improves slowly over the century, but access remains unequal. Hospitals are feared places, associated with death rather than recovery. When illness prevents work, families suffer immediately. Savings are rare. Wages stop at once. Charitable relief exists, but it is inconsistent and often humiliating. The workhouse looms as a final refuge, a place deliberately made harsh to discourage reliance. Entering it is seen as moral failure, even when circumstances leave no alternative. Old age, if reached, is precarious. Many do not live long enough to experience it. Those who do often depend on family or charity. Pensions are rare until the very end of the Victorian era, and even then limited. Aging bodies struggle to meet the demands of labor, yet rest is a privilege few can afford. Death remains familiar throughout life. Funerals are frequent, modest affairs. Mourning is ritualized but brief, constrained by necessity. The dead must be buried quickly, often in overcrowded cemeteries. Graves are reused. Memory competes with survival, and survival usually wins. Yet within this harshness, life continues. People form attachments. They laugh, argue, celebrate small victories. Community networks develop: neighbors who watch children, share food, exchange information about work. Mutual aid societies emerge, pooling small contributions to support members during illness or death. These informal systems provide a measure of security where formal structures fail. Religion continues to offer meaning, if not relief. For some, faith provides comfort and moral framework. For others, it reinforces acceptance of suffering as inevitable or divinely ordained. Churches also serve as social centers, offering education, charity, and a sense of belonging. As the Victorian era progresses, change slowly gathers momentum. Reform movements emerge, often driven by middle-class observers disturbed by the conditions of the poor. Laws regulating child labor, factory safety, and working hours are introduced, though enforcement is uneven. Public health initiatives begin addressing sanitation and clean water. Compulsory education becomes a reality near the end of the century. These changes do not transform daily life overnight. For most ordinary people, improvement is incremental and fragile. Gains can be undone by economic downturns, illness, or political shifts. Still, the idea that conditions might improve takes root. By the time you reach the later years of your life, the world may look slightly different from the one you were born into. Streets may be cleaner, schools more common, work marginally safer, but the core experience laboring to survive within a system that demands more than it gives remains familiar. Your life viewed from the outside might appear unremarkable, no famous deeds, no recorded achievements, yet it is lives like yours that sustain the machinery of the age. Factories run because you show up, cities function because you endure, families persist because you adapt. When death finally comes, it is rarely dramatic. More often it is quiet, a decline, an illness, a sudden failure of a body long overworked. You leave behind little in the way of possessions, perhaps some furniture, clothing, a few keepsakes. What remains is less tangible, habits passed down, expectations inherited, resilience taught by example. And long after your name is forgotten, the structures shaped by your labor endure. The modern city, the industrial economy, the social reforms born of visible hardship, all are built on the accumulated lives of people like you. You were born into smoke and steel, into a world that demanded endurance above all else. You survived not because the system protected you, but because you learned how to live within it. And as you consider this ordinary life marked by effort, loss, quiet strength, it invites a final reflection. How much of the modern world rests on the unnoticed endurance of those who never had the luxury of being remembered? Story 2. Bread, dripping, and weak tea. What ordinary Victorians really ate. You do not eat in Victorian England for pleasure. You eat because tomorrow demands it, because work requires it, because hunger, once ignored, becomes impossible to escape. Meals are not events but interruptions, brief pauses between labor, stitched into the day wherever time allows. What matters most is not flavor, variety, or presentation, but whether the food is filling, affordable, and reliable. Bread sits at the center of nearly every table. For working-class families, bread is life. It provides bulk, calories, and the illusion of fullness. A household's well-being can often be measured by the quality of its bread. White bread made from finely milled flour signals comfort or aspiration. Brown or coarse bread, dense and dark, is more common, cheaper, and filling. Stale bread is rarely wasted. It is soaked, toasted, fried, or turned into puddings. Nothing that can still be swallowed is thrown away. Butter is a luxury. More often, bread is spread with dripping, the fat left behind after roasting meat. Dripping is saved carefully, strained, and reused. It carries the memory of meat, even when meat itself is absent. For many families, this faint taste is as close as they come to richness. Meals are repetitive by necessity. Variety costs money, and money is uncertain. Breakfast may be bread and weak tea. Dinner eaten in the middle of the day for those who work long hours might be bread again, perhaps with cheese, onions, or a thin broth. Supper, taken late in the evening, is often minimal, sometimes nothing more than tea and bread once more. Tea is everywhere, but it is rarely strong. Leaves are reused until they give up nothing but color. Milk, if added, is watered down. Sugar is used sparingly, though its price falls over the century, making it one of the few indulgences accessible to the poor. Tea offers warmth, mild stimulation, and comfort. It also provides a safer alternative to water, which is often contaminated. Water is a constant concern. In many urban areas, clean water is unreliable or unavailable. Pumps may draw from polluted sources. Rivers carry waste from factories and households alike. Boiling water for tea makes it safer, even if no one fully understands why. Illness traced to water is common, but its cause remains mysterious for much of the century. Meat is rare, especially for the urban poor. When it appears, it is often in small quantities, stretched to feed many mouths. Stews and soups are favored, allowing bones and scraps to flavor large volumes of liquid. Offal liver, kidneys, tripe is more affordable than prime cuts and widely consumed. These foods are filling and nutritious, though often disliked by those who have little choice in eating them. Fresh vegetables are seasonal and inconsistent. Potatoes are a staple, cheap and filling. Cabbage, onions, turnips, and carrots appear frequently. They are usually boiled for long periods, reducing both texture and nutritional value. Spices are uncommon. Flavor is secondary to sustenance. For families living near markets, timing matters. Food purchased late in the day may be cheaper but closer to spoiling. Smell and appearance guide decisions. Preservation is limited. Without refrigeration, food must be eaten quickly or heavily salted. Salted meat and fish are common, though they increase thirst and strain already compromised health. Children eat what adults eat in smaller quantities. There is little concept of specialized children's food beyond infancy. Malnutrition is widespread, though rarely named as such. Stunted growth, poor teeth, and chronic weakness are common. Hunger is not always acute, but it is persistent, a dull presence that shapes behavior and expectations. Middle-class diets look different, but not indulgent by modern standards. Meals are structured and formal. Breakfast includes bread, eggs, perhaps meat. Dinner is the main meal, featuring multiple courses when finances allow. Even so, portion sizes are modest. Overindulgence is frowned upon, associated with moral weakness. Respectability is expressed through restraint as much as through abundance. Domestic manuals emphasize plain cooking, economy, and order. Wives are expected to manage household food efficiently, balancing nutrition, cost, and appearance. Waste is a moral failing. A well-run kitchen reflects character. Despite this emphasis on order, food safety remains precarious across all classes. Adulteration is widespread. Bread may contain chalk or alum. Milk is diluted or contaminated. Butter is colored artificially. These practices are common knowledge, yet difficult to avoid. Regulation exists only later in the century after public pressure mounts. Eating out is rare for the working poor. Street food fills the gap. Pie sellers, hot potato vendors, and oyster stalls offer cheap, filling options. These foods are convenient but not always safe. Still, they provide variety and relief from monotonous home meals. Hunger shapes social behavior. Invitations are weighed carefully. Hospitality is limited by resources. Sharing food is an act of generosity that carries real cost. Charity kitchens and soup runs appear during hard times, especially in winter or during economic downturns. Food is also a marker of morality. Temperance movements link alcohol consumption to poverty and disorder. Tea becomes a symbol of respectability, replacing gin in many households. Abstinence is encouraged, though not universally adopted. Alcohol remains a common escape from hunger and exhaustion. Festive meals stand out sharply against daily scarcity. Christmas dinners, when possible, include meat, pudding, and treats saved for weeks or months. These meals are remembered long after they are eaten. They offer a glimpse of abundance, however fleeting. As the century progresses, food availability slowly improves. Transportation networks expand. Imported foods become more common. Prices stabilize somewhat, yet inequality persists. For many, diet remains inadequate, shaped by wages that barely cover rent and fuel, let alone nourishment. Eating, then, is an act of endurance. Each meal is calculated, restrained, and repeated. Pleasure exists, but it is quiet and rare. The body is fed just enough to keep working, just enough to return the next day. And as you sit with your bread and tea, aware that this will sustain you but not strengthen you, a question lingers beneath the routine. How does a lifetime of barely enough shape the body and the expectations of an entire society? Over time, you stop thinking of hunger as an emergency. It becomes a condition managed, negotiated, anticipated. You learn how long you can go on less. You learn which meals can be thinned, which can be skipped, which must be protected at all costs. Eating becomes an exercise in calculation, not appetite. The household budget revolves around food more than anything else except rent. Rent is fixed and unforgiving. Food is flexible, which means it absorbs every shock. When wages fall, food quality declines first. When work is lost, meals shrink. When illness strikes, diets collapse into the cheapest possible forms of sustenance. Women, almost always, carry the responsibility for making food stretch. Shopping is strategic. Markets are visited late in the day when prices drop. Relationships with shopkeepers matter. Credit may be extended briefly, grudgingly, and remembered. A good reputation paying debts when able, not asking too often, can mean the difference between eating and not eating. Cooking is shaped by scarcity. Pots are rarely full. Soups are thin. Stews rely on water more than meat. Bones are boiled repeatedly, long after flavor is gone, in the hope that anything remains. Leftovers are transformed, reworked, disguised. Yesterday's bread becomes today's pudding. Cold potatoes are fried. Nothing is wasted unless it is truly inedible. Fuel is another constraint. Cooking requires coal or wood, both costly. Meals that require long simmering are planned carefully, often cooked alongside other tasks to maximize heat use. Baking at home is rare for the poorest families who lack ovens. Bread is bought, not made, increasing dependence on bakers and their prices. Children learn these rhythms early. They learn not to ask for more. They learn to eat slowly to make food last. They learn which foods are for guests and which are everyday. They notice when adults eat less so they can eat more. Malnutrition rarely announces itself dramatically. It shows up gradually: fatigue, frequent illness, slow healing, poor growth. Teeth decay early. Bones weaken. These conditions are common enough to be unremarkable. They are not recognized as preventable, only as unfortunate. Workplaces do little to accommodate nutritional needs. Factory shifts are long and breaks are brief. Workers bring food with them: bread wrapped in cloth, perhaps cheese or cold potatoes. Meals are eaten quickly, sometimes standing, often in dirty environments. There is little time or energy to savor anything. For those who work outdoors, dock laborers, construction workers, agricultural hands, caloric needs are high, but diets rarely meet them. Exhaustion accumulates. Alcohol becomes a supplement, providing calories and temporary relief. Beer is common, sometimes safer than water. Gin is cheaper and more destructive. Temperance advocates blame moral weakness. Workers understand it as coping. Middle-class households eat better, but remain bound by rigid rules. Meals are structured, timed, and hierarchical. The family eats together when possible, but servants eat separately, often after the family is finished, with leftovers. This separation reinforces class boundaries even within the same house. Menus emphasize plainness and restraint. Heavy seasoning is considered vulgar. Rich sauces are associated with excess. Moderation is moralized. Digestion is a frequent topic of concern, reflecting both genuine health anxieties and cultural fixation on self-control. Cookbooks proliferate, offering guidance on economical meals, proper portions, and household management. These books assume literacy, leisure, and access to ingredients that many do not have. Still, they shape ideals that filter down through society, reinforcing the notion that good management can overcome material limits even when it cannot. Food is deeply tied to respectability. A clean table, orderly meals, and restrained appetites signal moral character. Poverty that appears disorderly, dirty kitchens, irregular meals, visible hunger is judged harshly. Structural causes fade into the background, replaced by narratives of individual failure. Charity food exists, but it is conditional. Soup kitchens, bread lines, and charitable meals appear during crises, harsh winters, economic depressions, epidemics. They are often run by churches or philanthropic organizations. Assistance comes with expectations: gratitude, sobriety, moral improvement. Recipients are scrutinized. Relief is deliberately limited to avoid encouraging dependency. The workhouse looms here as well. Meals inside are intentionally monotonous and unappealing. Gruel, bread, thin soup. The diet is designed to sustain life while discouraging reliance. Hunger becomes a tool of policy. Public debates about food intensify as the century progresses. Reformers document diets, measure weights, and compare caloric intake to labor demands. The idea that underfeeding contributes to poverty gains traction, slowly. Scientific approaches to nutrition emerge, though practical application lags behind. Adulteration scandals expose the extent to which food is manipulated for profit. Public outrage leads to gradual regulation. Standards improve unevenly. Trust in food sources remains fragile. For ordinary people, these debates feel distant. What matters is what is on the table tonight. What can be afforded? What must be saved for tomorrow? Festive eating remains rare but deeply meaningful. Weddings, funerals, holidays, these occasions justify expense. Food becomes symbolic, abundance standing in for hope, continuity, belonging. Even when portions are small, the act of eating together matters. As you age, your relationship with food settles into habit. You know what to expect. You know what your body can tolerate. Appetite may dull, shaped by years of restraint. Pleasure becomes muted, associated more with warmth and routine than with flavor. By the late Victorian period, improvements are visible. Imported grains lower bread prices. Refrigeration begins to appear in limited contexts. Knowledge spreads. Yet inequality persists. Many still eat just enough to function, not enough to thrive. Food, then, is both sustenance and signal. It reveals class, health, morality, and power. It sustains labor while reflecting its costs. It fills stomachs while shaping expectations, teaching generations to accept enough as success. And as you finish another meal that satisfies hunger but not desire, another quiet question surfaces. What does it mean for a society when most of its people are fed only well enough to keep going, but never well enough to truly flourish? By the later years of the Victorian era, food begins slowly to change. Not suddenly and not equally, but noticeably enough that people comment on it. Bread becomes cheaper and more consistent in quality. Imported grain from North America and elsewhere lowers prices, reducing the constant fear of shortage that haunted earlier decades. For many families, this is the first time bread feels relatively secure. Yet memory lingers. Those who lived through years of scarcity do not easily trust abundance. Habits formed in hunger persist long after conditions improve. Bread is still saved. Fat is still scraped carefully from plates. Leftovers are still transformed rather than discarded. Waste feels dangerous, even immoral, because it recalls times when nothing was guaranteed. Public health reforms begin to reshape diets in subtle ways. Clean water initiatives reduce waterborne illness. Milk supply chains improve slightly, though contamination remains an issue. Food inspection laws curb the worst adulteration practices, restoring limited trust in staples like bread, butter, and tea. These changes improve survival more than satisfaction. Diets become marginally more nutritious, but still monotonous. For many working-class families, Meat remains an occasional presence rather than a staple. Vegetables are more available, but preparation habits change slowly. Knowledge does not automatically translate into capacity. Work patterns still dictate eating patterns. Long hours continue to compress meals into functional moments. Even when food improves, time does not. The structure of industrial life leaves little room for leisurely eating or experimentation. Meals remain practical, predictable, and brief. Children born later in the century experience slightly different relationships with food. School meals, though rare, appear in some areas. Nutrition becomes a topic of concern among reformers and educators. Height and weight measurements reveal patterns of improvement, though disparities remain stark. Middle-class households increasingly experiment with variety. New foods appear: tinned goods, imported fruits, packaged products. Advertising shapes tastes and aspirations. Eating becomes more closely tied to identity, status, and modernity. Cookbooks grow more elaborate. Kitchens become spaces of management rather than mere survival. Still, these developments rest on fragile foundations. Economic downturns, strikes, and illness can erase progress overnight. Families who climb slightly above subsistence remain only one crisis away from returning to it. The memory of hunger remains close. For the elderly, food often becomes more difficult again. Declining strength limits earning power. Teeth fail. Digestion weakens. Diets simplify further: soft foods, bread soaked in tea, thin soups. Dependence on family or charity increases. Pride often prevents asking for help until options narrow. Food remains moralized. Thinness is interpreted as virtue or failure depending on context. Appetite is scrutinized. Alcohol consumption remains controversial. Temperance movements continue to frame hunger and poverty as personal shortcomings rather than structural conditions. Yet alongside judgment, empathy grows. Investigations into working-class diets influence early welfare reforms. The idea that adequate nutrition is a social responsibility gains ground. It is tentative, contested, but present. By the end of the Victorian era, the groundwork for modern food systems is laid. Mass production, regulation, transportation, and public health initiatives reshape how societies feed themselves. The extreme instability of earlier decades begins to recede, at least in theory. But for those who lived through the worst years, food is never just food. It is memory, it is calculation, it is relief mixed with anxiety. Eating well feels temporary, almost suspicious. Hunger, once endured, leaves a permanent imprint not only on bodies but on expectations. The Victorian diet, plain and repetitive, does more than sustain life. It shapes character. It teaches restraint, endurance, and acceptance. It also limits growth, dulls pleasure, and normalizes just enough as success. Modern abundance, when it comes, rests on these lives, on generations who learned to survive without flourishing, to eat without enjoyment, to accept hunger as ordinary. And as you consider how food functions not just as nourishment but as habit and memory, one final question emerges. How much of our modern relationship with food, our fears of waste, our comforts, our excesses can be traced back to centuries when eating was never guaranteed? Story 3: 12 hours a day. Work, wages, and exhaustion in the industrial age. In Victorian England, time no longer belongs to you. It is claimed by bells, whistles, and clocks mounted high on factory walls, devices that divide the day into units of productivity rather than rest. Work does not begin when the sun rises or end when it sets. It begins when the machine demands it and ends when the overseer allows it. For much of the working population, the day starts before dawn. You wake in the dark, often cold, sometimes hungry. There is little time to linger. Washing is brief if it happens at all. Clothing is pulled on quickly, still damp from the night air. Breakfast is minimal: bread, weak tea, perhaps nothing. You step into the street with others moving in the same direction, drawn toward the same buildings that dominate the skyline. Factories announce themselves audibly. The morning whistle cuts through the city, sharp and unavoidable. It does not ask whether you are ready. It tells you that lateness has consequences. Wages are docked for minutes lost. Repeated lateness can mean dismissal, and dismissal can mean ruin. Inside, the air is thick. Textile mills are filled with cotton dust that settles into lungs and never quite leaves. Ironworks radiate heat even in winter. Chemical factories burn eyes and skin. Ventilation is poor. Windows are often sealed to maintain temperature or humidity. Light comes from gas lamps or narrow panes high above, insufficient and uneven. The noise is constant and overwhelming. Machines clatter, whir, pound, and hiss. Conversation is nearly impossible. Workers communicate with gestures or brief shouts. Over time, hearing dulls. Silence becomes unfamiliar. Work is repetitive by design. Tasks are broken down into small, precise movements repeated hundreds or thousands of times a day. Skill is less important than endurance and speed. Machines dictate pace. Falling behind disrupts the entire process and invites punishment not only from supervisors, but from fellow workers whose output depends on yours. Hours are long. 12-hour days are common. In some industries, 14 or more are not unusual, especially before reforms take hold. Breaks are short and infrequent. Meals are eaten quickly, often beside machines, hands still dirty from work. There is little separation between labor and sustenance. Children work alongside adults. They are smaller, cheaper, and easier to control. They crawl beneath machines to clean them while they are still running. They tie broken threads, carry heavy loads, and perform tasks that strain growing bodies. Fatigue is constant. Injuries are frequent. Deaths, when they occur, are recorded briefly and replaced quickly. Women form a large part of the industrial workforce. They are paid less than men, regardless of hours or output. Their wages are seen as supplementary, even when families depend on them entirely. Pregnancy does not exempt them from labor. Many work until the final weeks, returning as soon as possible after childbirth. Supervision is strict and often harsh. Overseers enforce rules through fines, dismissal, and physical punishment, especially earlier in the century. Talking, resting, or slowing down can be penalized. Workers are expected to maintain attention despite exhaustion. Accidents caused by fatigue are blamed on carelessness rather than conditions. Outside the factory, work continues in other forms. Dock laborers wait each morning for selection, uncertain whether they will earn anything that day. Builders, miners, and railway workers face physical danger daily. Agricultural laborers work long hours for low pay, their lives shaped by seasons and landowners rather than machines, but no less constrained. Wages are low and unstable. Payment is often weekly. Any interruption, illness, injury, factory shutdown halts income immediately. There is no paid leave, no sick pay, no guarantee of continued employment. Families budget carefully, knowing that one lost week can unravel months of effort. Payment systems vary. Some workers are paid by the piece rather than the hour, incentivizing speed at the expense of safety. Others face fines for mistakes, damage, or perceived misconduct. These deductions are often arbitrary and difficult to contest. Work defines social identity. You are known by what you do, not who you are. Occupation shapes status, prospects, and health. Some trades carry prestige, most do not. Advancement is limited. Apprenticeships exist but are increasingly rare in large-scale industry. Skill gives way to replaceability. Rest is scarce. Sundays offer relief, but even then, household labor continues. Clothes must be washed, food prepared, children cared for. For many, church attendance fills the day, offering structure rather than relaxation. True leisure, unstructured, restorative, is rare. Exhaustion becomes a baseline state. Bodies adapt but at a cost. Chronic pain is common. Sleep is deep but insufficient. Dreams, when they occur, are often fragmented. Injuries heal slowly. Illness lingers. Many workers die young, worn down rather than struck down. Despite this, resistance exists. Workers talk quietly. Complaints circulate. Mutual aid societies form, offering small protections against illness or death. Early trade unions emerge, often illegally, facing suppression and hostility. Strikes occur, though they are risky and frequently unsuccessful. Employers frame long hours as necessity. Productivity must be maintained. Competition is fierce. Reform is resisted as impractical or dangerous, yet public awareness grows. Investigations expose conditions. Reports describe exhaustion, injury, and exploitation in careful detail. Gradually, laws appear. The Factory Acts begin to limit child labor and working hours, though enforcement is uneven. Inspections are rare. Loopholes are common. Progress is slow and contested. For many workers, daily life changes little in the short term. Still, the idea that work might have limits takes hold. Time, once entirely claimed by labor, begins very slightly to push back. The notion that exhaustion is not inevitable, that it is imposed, gains ground. But for now, as you stand at your station, watching the clock inch forward, counting hours not in freedom but in survival, the day stretches endlessly ahead. And beneath the noise, beneath the fatigue, a question forms, quiet, persistent, and dangerous if spoken aloud. How long can a body endure this pace before something essential finally gives way? If you work long enough in Victorian England, your body begins to tell the story for you. It shows in the hands first. Fingers thicken, joints swell, nails split and darken with ingrained dirt that never fully comes out. Cuts heal poorly. Burns leave shiny scars. For textile workers, skin becomes dry and irritated, lungs tight with dust. For metalworkers, heat and vibration settle deep into bones. Each trade leaves its own mark, visible to those who know how to look. Fatigue is not an occasional state, it is continuous. You wake tired and go to bed tired, carrying exhaustion forward from one day to the next. Sleep is deep but rarely restorative. Crowded housing means noise never fully stops. Beds are shared. Shifts overlap. One person rises while another lies down. Rest is fragmented, stolen in pieces rather than granted whole. Injuries are expected. Minor ones are ignored. There is no time to stop for a cut finger or strained back. Stopping risks wages, reputation, or employment altogether. Serious injuries, crushed limbs, broken bones, permanent disability end working lives abruptly. Compensation, when it exists, is minimal or non-existent. Families absorb the loss as best they can. Many workers develop chronic conditions early. Breath shortens, coughs deepen, pain becomes background noise. Few articulate these problems as injustice. They are understood as part of working life, unavoidable and personal rather than systemic. Illness complicates everything. A single sick day can mean lost pay. A sick week can mean debt. A prolonged illness can unravel an entire household economy. Decisions are made carefully. Can you afford to rest or must you work through it? Often, the answer is to keep going until the body forces a stop. Women face particular pressures. Those who work outside the home balance paid labor with domestic responsibilities. After long shifts, they return to cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Pregnancy offers no formal protection. Miscarriages are common and rarely spoken of. Childbirth injuries often go untreated, becoming lifelong impairments. Men face different expectations. They are judged by their ability to provide steadily. Unemployment carries shame as well as hardship. Men injured at work may find themselves unable to fulfill expected roles, straining marriages and family structures. Alcohol becomes a coping mechanism for some, a source of conflict for others. Wages rarely rise in proportion to effort. Pay reflects position, not endurance. Skilled workers earn more, but skill is increasingly undervalued in mechanized industries. Employers prefer cheaper labor that can be replaced easily. Loyalty is rarely rewarded. Experience matters only insofar as it increases output. Economic cycles amplify insecurity. Boom periods bring overtime and longer hours. Busts bring layoffs, short time, or sudden closures. Workers have little warning and no recourse. Savings, if any exist, are quickly consumed. Families slide back toward poverty with alarming speed. To manage this uncertainty, workers develop strategies. Multiple family members work if possible. Children's wages become essential. Lodgers are taken in to share rent. Meals are reduced. Clothing is repaired endlessly. Social networks are activated, borrowing, trading, helping where possible. Mutual aid societies play a crucial role. Workers contribute small amounts regularly to funds that support members during illness, injury, or death. These societies provide not only financial assistance but a sense of solidarity. They are fragile, dependent on members' continued ability to contribute, but they offer some protection in an otherwise unforgiving system. Early unions attempt to address working conditions collectively. They organize strikes, negotiate wages, and demand shorter hours. Success is limited. Employers resist fiercely. Strikers risk blacklisting. Legal protections are weak. Public opinion is divided, often hostile. Still, the idea that workers might act together gains ground. Public inquiries begin documenting conditions. Reports describe long hours, dangerous machinery, and exhausted workers in measured language that nevertheless shocks readers. Reformers use these findings to argue for regulation. Opponents warn of economic collapse if industry is constrained. Legislation inches forward. Limits on child labor, maximum hours for women, safety requirements. Each law marks a small shift. Enforcement remains inconsistent. Inspectors are few. Employers adapt creatively. Workers often see little immediate improvement. Yet expectations begin to change. The idea that exhaustion is not a personal failing, but a consequence of conditions slowly takes hold. Workers talk more openly about limits. The language of rights emerges alongside the language of duty. For many, however, daily life remains unchanged. You still rise before dawn. You still count hours. You still measure time in wages earned rather than energy spent. The body adapts until it cannot. And as the years pass, as effort accumulates without relief, another question presses in heavier now, shaped by experience rather than fear. If work consumes the best years of your strength, what is left for the rest of your life? By the time you reach your middle years, work has done more than fill your days. It has shaped your body, your habits, and your expectations of life itself. You move with learned efficiency. Hands know which motions repeat best. Eyes detect irregularities in machinery, materials, or measurements almost unconsciously. Your endurance has increased, but so has your wear. Knees ache, backs stiffen. Lungs carry the remnants of dust, fibers, or fumes. Hearing is dulled by decades of clatter. Pain is no longer an occasional visitor. It is a constant companion. Wages earned over long hours allow for survival but rarely comfort. Some families scrape together enough to rent slightly larger rooms, repair clothing, or buy small treats for holidays. Savings are minimal, yet they provide a fragile sense of security. Debt is an ever-present threat, taken to cover emergencies or lapsed wages. For most, financial life is a constant negotiation between scarcity and necessity. Work dominates not only the body but the calendar. Sundays are brief respites, filled with chores, errands, or church. Even holidays are tinged with preparation or worry. Leisure is small and irregular, a brief walk, a simple game, storytelling around the hearth. Entertainment exists but is constrained by energy and money. Life outside labor is an extension of labor itself. Children, now grown, enter the workforce early. You teach them, sometimes explicitly, often by example, how to endure. They learn to ration food, conserve energy, and accept long hours as ordinary. Your life has normalized labor in such a way that the cycle repeats. Survival is paramount, ambition optional. Dreams are tempered by practicality, by the visible fragility of human strength under relentless work. Illness and injury accumulate. The body remembers what it has endured. Tuberculosis, chronic cough, rheumatism, joint deformities, all are familiar companions. Some coworkers and neighbors do not survive these stresses. Funerals are frequent, marking a steady attrition of the workforce. Your own mortality is never abstract. It is observed daily, visible in colleagues whose hands no longer obey, whose bodies fail, whose labor stops abruptly. Despite hardship, community remains vital. Neighbors support one another with borrowed coal, childcare, or shared meals. Trade societies, church groups, and informal networks provide small but essential protections. Solidarity grows in the spaces left by the state, creating bonds that are practical but often deeply felt. Survival depends on both endurance and connection. Legislation slowly alters daily life. Factory acts reduce working hours for children and women. Safety inspections appear imperfect but symbolic. Unions gain a foothold, allowing collective bargaining where it was once unimaginable. Hours shorten incrementally. Conditions improve, but the change is slow and incomplete. Much of the workforce remains vulnerable. By the later Victorian era, mechanized labor is still harsh, but the narrative begins to shift. Workers, observers, and policymakers slowly recognize that human bodies have limits. Economic arguments no longer fully justify exploitation. Public opinion begins to value life and health alongside production. Small reforms accumulate into a larger cultural awareness. Labor is not merely a resource but a human endeavor with consequences. When your own working life ends, whether through age, injury, or illness, it is not celebrated with ceremony. It is quiet, practical, and constrained. You may rely on children, charity, or meager pensions. You leave work behind, but its effects remain in your body, in your habits, and in the rhythm of your days. Looking back, it is clear that the industrial age has transformed the very concept of time, endurance, and expectation. Labor shapes not just bodies but identity. Work defines purpose, social position, and survival. Life is measured not in years, but in output, in wages, in hours endured. Families, communities, and society itself revolve around the demands of machines and the economy. And as you consider how these long hours have touched everything from bodies to social norms, one final reflection arises. If a society's rhythm is dictated by unrelenting labor, what does that teach its people about the value of life, the meaning of rest, and the cost of human endurance? Story 4: Rooms without air, housing, slums, and the geography of poverty. You do not choose the streets you are born into in Victorian England. They choose you. The shape of your life is drawn, in part, by the location of your family's home, the structure of the building, and the density of neighbors stacked above, below, and beside you. In industrial cities like London, Manchester, Leeds, or Birmingham, housing for the working poor is cramped, dark, and often dangerous. Entire families, sometimes 10 or more people, share a single dwelling, usually no more than 1 or 2 small rooms. Upstairs rooms are accessible only by narrow stairs, sometimes partially rotten. Basements are damp, prone to flooding, and nearly devoid of ventilation. Privacy is virtually non-existent. The air is thick, not only with human activity but with coal smoke, soot, and the stench of uncollected waste. Chimneys puff coal into streets, sewers run openly or overflow, and nearby factories spew dust and chemical fumes. You breathe these toxins from birth. They cling to walls, clothing, and skin. Respiratory illness is common. Children cough, adults wheeze. Sickness is a constant companion, rarely surprising but always taxing. Homes themselves are fragile. Rents are high relative to wages, leaving landlords little incentive to improve conditions. Floors sag, windows are cracked, roofs leak, doors do not close properly. Families learn to live with drafts, cold, and damp as routine features rather than emergencies. Sanitation is minimal. Privies may be shared by multiple households, often located at the rear of the property. Waste management is inconsistent. Streets are littered with refuse and cholera epidemics erupt in predictable cycles. Water is drawn from polluted sources, further exacerbating disease. Awareness of germs is limited. Miasma, bad air, is blamed. Yet nothing is truly done until reformers force change. Overcrowding shapes every aspect of life. Mealtimes are rushed, bodies jostle for space, and beds are shared or improvised. Families adapt through strict routines. Children sleep in shifts, adults rotate spaces, and belongings are stacked, hung, or hidden wherever possible. Yet these arrangements are precarious. A sick person can affect the entire household. Contagion spreads quickly. Privacy is an almost impossible luxury. The geography of poverty extends beyond walls. Slum streets are narrow, winding, and filthy. Alleyways funnel refuse, rainwater, and sewage alike. Markets are close but irregular. Factories loom. Open spaces are rare. Noise, dogs barking, carts rattling, workmen shouting never ceases. Streets become extensions of living space. Children play where horses pass, women wash laundry beside open drains, and men repair tools while listening for the factory whistle. Life in these conditions is an exercise in adaptation. Families develop strategies to survive, pooling wages, renting to outsiders, sharing furniture, and improvising solutions to heat, light, and storage. Still, safety is often secondary to affordability. Buildings collapse. Fires spread quickly through wooden frames, often claiming multiple families. Escape routes are limited, and fire services are slow to respond. Housing also enforces social hierarchy. Middle-class neighborhoods are spacious, ventilated, and well-lit. Working-class neighborhoods are dense, squalid, and overlooked. Streets define opportunity. Schools, hospitals, and clean water are scarce where poverty clusters. Children's futures are shaped as much by walls and air as by parents or ambition. Within these narrow, smoky rooms, daily life persists. Cooking, cleaning, mending, and caregiving occupy every available surface and moment. The domestic sphere, compressed and chaotic, becomes both stage and trap. Family bonds are strengthened by shared struggle, yet tensions simmer constantly, amplified by fatigue, illness, and frustration. The poorest families sometimes turn to lodging houses, shared accommodations where multiple households rent individual beds or rooms. Privacy is minimal. Hygiene is worse. Conflicts arise easily. Still, these spaces are preferable to homelessness or overcrowded tenements. Even the act of sleeping is fraught. Beds are hard, narrow, often broken. Linen is reused and rarely fresh. Sickness spreads in the night. Noise prevents deep rest. The body adapts, but fatigue accumulates day after day, year after year. Housing is more than shelter. It shapes identity, expectation, and survival. Where you live affects your health, your education, your work, and your social network. It defines who you meet, how you interact, and what opportunities you can access. It imposes constraints as rigid as factory hours or street violence. And through all this, the question that shadows daily life remains. How much of a life can unfold when the very walls meant to protect you are themselves a constant threat? Life in Victorian slums is defined by improvisation and endurance. Every family must navigate a web of constraints: space, money, disease, and social expectation, while trying to maintain some semblance of order. Survival is not heroic. It is practical, repetitive, and exhausting. Crowding forces adaptation. Children sleep in shifts. Beds are pulled from under tables during the day and returned at night. Tables, chairs, and cupboards are repurposed as storage, seating, or sleeping surfaces. Every inch of space is contested. Privacy is rare, even for adults, and quarrels over territory are common. Discipline, care, and negotiation exist side by side, a delicate balance maintained by necessity. Sanitation shapes daily routines. Toilets may be shared by a dozen families. Chamber pots are emptied into open drains or gutters. Wash water flows into streets. Smoke, dust, and sewage mingle in the narrow lanes, creating conditions ripe for cholera, typhus, and smallpox. Families develop strategies, boiling water when possible, keeping sick members isolated, or avoiding certain areas during outbreaks. Knowledge is learned through experience rather than formal instruction. Cooking is another challenge. Open flames in small rooms risk fires. Fuel is scarce. Coal or wood must be purchased or scavenged, sometimes in dangerous conditions. Meals are prepared quickly, often on the floor or on shared stoves. Odors accumulate in the confined air. Meals that take too long to cook may never be eaten. Creativity is limited by safety, cost, and space. Neighbors are both lifeline and hazard. In these crowded quarters, conflict is constant. Noise, theft, and disagreements flare easily. Yet mutual aid is essential. Food, clothing, and advice are shared. Children are supervised communally. Information about jobs, health risks, or police activity travels quickly through these networks. Community is forged in necessity, but it is fragile and precarious. Structural hazards compound danger. Floors are weak. Stairs are narrow and rickety. Roofs leak. Fires spread rapidly, often consuming multiple homes in a single night. Ventilation is poor. Damp walls and stagnant air encourage respiratory illness. Window glass is rare. Openings are covered with cloth or board, further trapping smoke and disease. In some neighborhoods, lodging houses provide minimal shelter for transient workers. These establishments are overcrowded and poorly regulated. 10 or more strangers may share a single room. Beds are stacked or shared. Hygiene is rudimentary. Conflict and violence are common. Yet these spaces offer stability for those without family, employment, or permanent housing. Even the act of working is shaped by housing. Proximity to factories, workshops, and markets dictates opportunity. Those living far from employment face long, exhausting walks or costly transport. Housing location becomes both constraint and opportunity, determining not only survival but potential advancement. The poorest neighborhoods also shape mortality. Disease spreads rapidly. Tuberculosis, cholera, dysentery, and influenza thrive where ventilation is limited and sanitation poor. Children are especially vulnerable. Infant mortality is high. Families live with repeated losses, learning to grieve quietly, quickly, and without reprieve. Death is woven into daily life. Yet ordinary life continues. Families cook, clean, care for children, mend clothing, and maintain fragile routines. Small rituals, Sunday meals, birthday celebrations, religious observances provide structure and a sense of control, however temporary. These practices sustain morale, maintain identity, and assert humanity in otherwise dehumanizing conditions. Housing, then, is more than shelter. It is a force that shapes health, opportunity, and social networks. Where you live dictates your exposure to risk, your access to work, and your possibilities for advancement. Slums are not simply places of poverty. They are environments that cultivate adaptation, resilience, and endurance, while simultaneously enforcing limits on growth, education, and well-being. And as the city grows, new buildings rise elsewhere while the slums persist, sometimes improving slightly, sometimes deteriorating further. The people who endure these spaces ask themselves, silently, day after day, how much of life can survive in a place where every breath is contested, every step measured, and every wall a reminder of both protection and peril? As decades pass, the slum's influence becomes inescapable. It is not merely a place to sleep or cook. It is a shaping force, molding bodies, habits, and expectations. You carry it with you, its smells, its sounds, its cramped geometry, even when you leave for work, for school, or for moments of fleeting leisure. Illness is a near-constant companion. Children cough and wheeze before they can walk properly. Adults develop chronic respiratory problems from soot, coal dust, and damp air. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, cholera, and dysentery claim victims silently, steadily, and indiscriminately. Life expectancy in the densest neighborhoods remains decades below that of the more affluent. Mortality is measured not in statistics, but in absences at mealtimes, empty beds, and unfilled chairs. Still, families persist. Adaptation is both practical and psychological. You learn to ration space and energy. Beds, tables, and possessions are shared. Conflicts are managed because survival depends on cooperation. Stories and songs, whispered in the night or told around small hearths, maintain identity and morale. Even in squalor, humans create rhythm, ritual, and meaning. The city itself is a living, breathing organism, and slums are integral parts. They locate labor near factories, workshops, and markets. They allow families to remain within reach of work, even if that proximity comes at a health cost. The geography of poverty is also geography of survival, in which endurance is a form of skill rather than merely suffering. Yet the system is fragile. Fires devastate entire streets. Flooding submerges basements. Epidemics sweep through narrow lanes with predictable cruelty. Those without the support of neighbors or family are most at risk. The weakest children, the elderly, the sick bear the brunt. Death does not discriminate, but it is amplified by circumstance. Reform emerges slowly. Philanthropists and social investigators document conditions in vivid detail, highlighting overcrowding, disease, and the human cost of neglect. Early housing regulations begin to limit maximum occupancy and require basic sanitation, though enforcement is sporadic. Streets may be widened, sewers repaired, and some buildings replaced with better ventilated tenements. Even with reform, slums persist. Economic necessity anchors families where they can afford rent, regardless of improvements. Old buildings remain, rents remain high relative to wages, and overcrowding continues. The cycles of poverty, illness, and survival repeat, though occasionally punctuated by incremental gains. For those who survive, endurance is both a mark of skill and a burden. You know how to navigate damp floors, stinking privies, and noisy neighbors. You can maintain food, clothes, and health with minimal resources. Yet you also know the toll it takes on body and mind. Aging is accelerated by long years of deprivation. Strength wanes early. Fatigue accumulates in ways that leave permanent marks. Housing defines social expectations, too. Children internalize lessons about scarcity, hygiene, and cooperation. They learn that a life constrained by walls and air is normal. Dreams beyond survival exist but must be negotiated carefully with reality. Social mobility is limited. The physical space you inhabit signals the possibilities and boundaries of life itself. And yet within this framework, humanity persists. People laugh, quarrel, and love. Neighborhoods form informal networks to share news, goods, and support. Festivals and rituals provide brief reprieves from constant labor and care. Life is hard, but it is lived fully in the spaces available. Finally, as the city grows and reforms gradually alter housing stock, the legacy of the slum remains. It shapes how people interact, how they manage scarcity, how they view work, health, and community. The lessons learned in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms echo across generations, influencing behavior, resilience, and expectations long after better housing becomes available. And so, when you look at the ordinary Victorian street, the narrow lane, the tenement with its leaning walls, the basement window barely above ground, you realize that these homes were more than structures. They were crucibles. They forged endurance, adaptation, and quiet courage, but at a cost that few outside the neighborhood would ever fully comprehend. The thought that lingers, unspoken but persistent, is this: if the walls that protect you can also confine, poison, and weaken, how much of a life is truly yours when survival is never optional? Story 5. Illness in the alleyways, disease, death, and daily risk in Victorian cities. In Victorian cities, danger often wears no face. It is invisible, odorless at first, yet pervasive. Disease is everywhere, seeping from contaminated water, clinging to dust, carried by rats, insects, and human contact. It shapes life more reliably than work, wages, or weather. Cholera is one of the most feared visitors. Epidemics arrive suddenly, sometimes sweeping through neighborhoods in weeks. Symptoms appear quickly: vomiting, diarrhea, collapse. Death follows within days. Houses and streets themselves become vectors, as sewage spills into water sources and neighbors' practices determine survival as much as luck or constitution. Knowledge of transmission is incomplete early in the century. The miasma theory dominates thinking, attributing illness to bad air rather than contaminated water. Tuberculosis or consumption is slower, more insidious. It attacks the lungs, creating a persistent cough, fatigue, and weight loss. It thrives in the overcrowded, damp homes of the working class. The disease may linger for months or years, eroding strength and productivity. Families live alongside it, adjusting schedules, rationing care, and watching children and adults decline. Death is almost routine, yet every instance leaves its emotional mark. Smallpox and measles pose further threats. Outbreaks among children are common and often deadly. Families are forced to quarantine, isolating the sick in cramped quarters with the rest of the household at risk. Vaccination exists, but uptake is uneven, influenced by cost, access, and suspicion. Those who survive bear scars, literal and figurative, that mark them for life. Infant mortality is devastatingly high. Many children die before reaching their first birthday. Loss becomes normalized, part of the rhythm of daily life. Funerals are frequent, often modest and brief, reflecting both economic limits and the sheer frequency of death. Mothers grieve silently, as grief itself must be measured against the pressing needs of surviving children and household work. Infection is not only a matter of biology, it is deeply social. Houses are crowded, streets narrow, and public facilities scarce. Waste contaminates water, food, and air. Flies carry germs from open drains to food. Laundry dries over the same areas where children play. Every interaction carries risk, yet life cannot pause. Work, travel, and daily chores continue alongside danger. Public health is rudimentary. Officials sometimes recognize the patterns of epidemics, yet enforcement of sanitation regulations is sporadic. Sewers are repaired only after outbreaks. Street cleaning is inconsistent. Water quality varies by neighborhood. For many, avoiding disease is a matter of careful observation, local knowledge, and habit. Which pumps are safe, which streets flood in rain, which neighbors are reliable sources of advice. Doctors are present but limited. Medical care is expensive, and hospitals are often feared rather than embraced. Treatments are basic, sometimes harmful, and rarely preventative. Families must decide. Spend money on a practitioner who may fail or endure illness at home. Decisions are made under extreme pressure, often with incomplete information. Food, already scarce, compounds vulnerability. Malnutrition weakens resistance to disease. Repeated bouts of diarrhea or influenza can leave children permanently stunted. Adults are weakened, labor productivity declines, and households teeter on the edge of crisis. A single illness can ripple through an entire family, disrupting work, income, and survival. Rats and vermin exacerbate the problem. They carry plague and contaminate food and water. They burrow through walls, scavenge in refuse, and thrive in overcrowded basements. Families combat them with traps, cats, and vigilance, but success is inconsistent. Vermin are part of life, a constant background hazard that shapes how you store food, secure space, and sleep. Despite the omnipresence of risk, life continues. Children play, adults work, and communities endure. Habits develop, washing hands when possible, boiling water, cleaning surfaces, keeping the sick isolated. Some knowledge is empirical, learned through trial and error, observation, and shared experience. Other aspects remain mysterious, waiting for science to catch up. Disease teaches adaptation and vigilance. Families anticipate outbreaks, store food carefully, and plan work around potential quarantines. They watch neighbors' practices closely, noting who is safe to interact with and which streets carry danger. Survival depends on attention, prudence, and constant negotiation with the environment. And yet, even in these dire conditions, humans persist. You laugh, eat, quarrel, and work alongside invisible threats. Each day survived is a small victory against forces beyond control. But questions linger in the air as persistently as the odors of the city streets. If death walks alongside life as an everyday companion, how does it shape not only behavior but the very expectations of childhood, adulthood, and community? In Victorian cities, disease is not a sporadic visitor, it is an invisible rhythm, a constant beat that structures daily life. Families live under its shadow, calculating risk with every choice, however small. Survival is not just about avoiding illness. It is about managing resources, time, and social networks to navigate an environment where sickness is inevitable. Water is the first concern. Wells, pumps, and rivers are convenient but often contaminated. You learn which sources are safe and which are dangerous. Boiling water helps, but fuel is scarce. A single misjudgment, drinking from the wrong pump, letting water sit uncovered, can result in days of illness or worse. Children are especially vulnerable, yet they move freely in streets, collecting water, playing, and learning these rules only through experience. Food preparation carries similar hazards. Leftovers are common, fresh meat is rare. Bread may contain impurities. Vegetables are often washed with contaminated water. Families make trade-offs. Do you risk illness to feed a child properly, or ration more cautiously and hope for resilience? Every meal is a balance between sustenance and danger. Hygiene is a constant calculation. Bathing is limited by space, fuel, and water. Clothing is worn repeatedly, patched endlessly. Floors and walls are swept or scrubbed only when possible. Families learn which cleaning methods work best in damp, crowded conditions, and which are cosmetic rather than protective. Soap, when affordable, is treasured, yet often in short supply. The sick are isolated when possible, but this is rarely complete. Rooms are small, air is shared, and care requires proximity. A child's cough is both a signal and a threat. You must balance empathy with survival. Adults make hard choices. Who sleeps together, who eats first, who is cared for, and who is allowed to risk exposure. These decisions are constant, pragmatic, and emotionally taxing. Children's mortality shapes families profoundly. Losing one child is tragic. Losing several is a normalized sorrow. Parents internalize risk, observing symptoms constantly, planning meals, and regulating play to minimize exposure. Yet the lessons learned are uneven, sometimes too late to prevent death. Children, in turn, learn early that illness is part of life, shaping how they play, eat, and understand the world. Public institutions intervene sporadically. Workhouse infirmaries, charitable hospitals, and occasional street cleaning are attempts at control, but coverage is uneven. Crowded hospitals may spread infection rather than contain it. Quarantine rules are applied inconsistently. Reformers document conditions meticulously, seeking legislation to improve sanitation, water, and housing, but progress is slow and contested. Rats, flies, and other vermin amplify the risk. Food storage is a daily challenge. Grains and vegetables must be protected from scavengers. Meat, if present, is carefully salted or cooked, but spoilage is common. Vermin control requires constant vigilance, traps, cats, and careful housekeeping, but success is incomplete. They are another constant presence, a reminder that survival depends on attention to both human and environmental hazards. Labor interacts dangerously with disease. Overcrowded workshops, factories, and markets become sites of rapid contagion. Absenteeism is costly. Sick children may force adults to miss work. Pain, fatigue, and malnutrition make infection more likely. Families are trapped in cycles where work sustains income, but exposes bodies to greater risk, creating a constant tension between survival and exposure. Social networks become survival tools. Neighbors share advice about which streets are flooded, which water pumps are safe, or which vendors sell contaminated food. Kinship networks provide temporary refuge when illness strikes. Local charities provide food or minimal care during outbreaks. These networks are fragile but essential, a social adaptation to environmental and economic vulnerability. Yet amidst this vigilance, life continues. Children play in alleys, adults work and socialize, and the rhythm of daily activity persists alongside disease. Stories, humor, and rituals offer relief from the constant threat. Births, marriages, and small celebrations punctuate life, even as mortality hovers. In this environment, survival becomes an exercise in calculation, observation, and endurance. You measure risk constantly: where to fetch water, what to eat, how to care for the sick. Every decision carries weight. Every day survived is a testament to human resilience, but also to the relentless pressure of urban poverty. And as you weigh each movement, each choice, each step in the alleys of these cities, a stark question lingers. When life is a constant negotiation with invisible threats, what does health even mean, and who gets to define it? By the late Victorian era, the deadly rhythms of urban life are beginning to meet resistance, but only gradually, and only unevenly. Disease still stalks the alleys, but knowledge, reform, and slow improvements begin to shift outcomes. Cholera outbreaks, once sudden and indiscriminate, become partially preventable as public awareness grows. The work of John Snow, linking contaminated water to infection, begins to influence sanitation planning. Sewer systems are improved, water sources protected, and public health campaigns educate the population, though enforcement is inconsistent, and many neighborhoods remain neglected. Death no longer feels entirely inevitable, but fear remains embedded in daily routines. Tuberculosis continues to claim lives silently, yet reformers advocate for better ventilation, cleaner housing, and isolation of the sick when possible. Hospitals, once feared, begin to offer slightly safer spaces for treatment. Charitable dispensaries provide basic care for the poor, and emerging medical knowledge slowly informs daily practices. Boiling water, washing hands, and separating the sick from the healthy become recognized as protective measures. Infant mortality slowly declines with better nutrition, vaccination programs, and maternal education. But the shadow of loss persists. Families who have endured repeated deaths adapt emotionally, culturally, and socially. Grief is tempered by practicality. Care and labor cannot pause for mourning. The cycles of life and death continue, but with incremental mitigation. Everyday habits forged in the crucible of survival persist even as conditions improve. Families continue to ration food, prioritize water safety, and monitor children's health vigilantly. Neighborhood networks born of necessity remain essential. Mutual aid societies, church groups, and informal kin networks provide financial and emotional support, filling gaps that government intervention cannot yet reach. These social structures are as important for survival as soap, clean water, or food. Labor and disease remain intertwined. Work exposes bodies to risk, but also ensures income to buy safer water, better food, or medical attention. Families continue to negotiate this trade-off daily. Even small disruptions, illness, injury, or economic downturn can tip the delicate balance of survival. The calculus learned over decades informs how households respond to everything from epidemics to employment instability. The poorest neighborhoods continue to bear the brunt of risk. Disease lingers where infrastructure is weakest, overcrowding persists, and resources remain scarce. Yet reform, slow and partial as it is, sets the stage for the 20th century. Public health ordinances, improved housing, vaccination campaigns, and safer water gradually reshape what life means for urban populations. The lessons learned in the Victorian slums about hygiene, ventilation, waste disposal, and social networks inform policy and practice long after the worst years have passed. Even so, the psychological and cultural legacy of living with death and disease endures. Children grow up learning to fear invisible threats, adults remain vigilant, and the very notion of normal health is defined by what can survive in adverse conditions. Bodies bear the scars of exposure, weakened lungs, stunted growth, and lifelong fatigue. Communities bear the scars of repeated loss. These marks are invisible to outsiders but deeply inscribed in the fabric of daily life. Amidst the fear and fatigue, life continues to assert itself. People marry, have children, celebrate milestones, and maintain hope. Humor, stories, and ritual provide relief. Endurance becomes a kind of skill, resilience a tacit expectation, and survival a quiet triumph. Every day lived despite disease is itself an accomplishment. And finally, when we look at the alleyways of Victorian cities, the narrow lanes, the crowded tenements, the open sewers, the wharves and markets, we see not only decay and danger, but also human ingenuity, adaptation, and persistence. Life in these conditions is a negotiation with invisible threats, a constant balancing act, and a testament to resilience. The question that echoes after centuries is both simple and profound. If generations are raised to expect danger and loss as normal, how does that shape not only their bodies, but their hopes, their choices, and their sense of what life can be? Story 6. Fire, Smoke, and Soot: The Hidden Hazards of Urban Industry. In Victorian cities, smoke is more than a byproduct, it is a constant companion. From dawn to dusk, the skyline is blurred with soot. Chimneys belch unfiltered coal smoke into narrow streets, and factories, workshops, and homes alike contribute to an ever-present haze. The air tastes acrid, coats the tongue, irritates the eyes, and settles deep in the lungs of every city dweller. Industrialization transformed urban landscapes. Ironworks, textile mills, breweries, and chemical factories dominate cityscapes. Their furnaces burn relentlessly, feeding machines, boilers, and kilns. The soot that rises from coal fires covers buildings, streets, and clothing. Washing removes only surface residue. Lungs, hair, and skin retain particles indefinitely. Even on a clear day, the horizon appears hazy, as though the city itself were perpetually shrouded. This smoke is more than aesthetic, it is toxic. Respiratory illness is pervasive. Chronic coughs, asthma-like symptoms, and bronchitis are common among adults. Children are especially vulnerable. Lungs under development struggle against particulate matter and chemical irritants. By middle age, many workers display the wear of inhaled soot, blackened nails, discolored skin, and lungs compromised by decades of exposure. Deaths from respiratory disease are frequent and largely accepted as normal in the poorest neighborhoods. Fire is another constant hazard. The combination of open flames, poorly constructed buildings, and flammable materials turns every workshop, warehouse, and home into a potential inferno. Textile mills, in particular, are notorious for fires. Cotton dust ignites easily, and wooden floors, staircases, and beams propagate flames rapidly. Factory whistles may signal breaks, but they also warn of accident or emergency. Families and workers alike live with the knowledge that a single spark can annihilate property and life. Soot is both ubiquitous and deceptive. On surfaces, it is benign in appearance, just black residue. But when disturbed, it becomes airborne, entering eyes, noses, and lungs. Workers sweep floors, repair machines, or transport goods daily, unknowingly inhaling particles that will accumulate over years. Clothing, bedding, and curtains retain traces of soot indefinitely. Cleanliness is relative. Washing can remove only what is visible, not what is embedded in hair, skin, or lungs. Within homes, coal fires heat rooms, cook meals, and boil water, but they also pollute the air. Ventilation is limited. Windows are small or broken, and chimneys often carry smoke back into living spaces. Soot settles on walls and furniture. Cooking and heating become constant negotiations with inhaled fumes. Families adapt. Doors and windows are opened when weather permits. Children are moved away from stoves, and clothing is layered to avoid burns, but complete protection is impossible. Chemical hazards emerge alongside smoke and fire. Factories producing dyes, acids, and metals release fumes that irritate eyes, skin, and lungs. Lead and arsenic contamination is common in workshops and housing. Workers experience rashes, hair loss, and gradual neurological decline. Women and children, often tasked with secondary or supporting roles in these factories, are particularly exposed to these dangers, with little understanding of the long-term consequences. Noise accompanies fire and smoke. Hammering, stamping, and clanging from nearby mills mix with whistles, sirens, and street activity. Hearing deteriorates over years, sometimes irreversibly. Combined with pollution, noise adds to fatigue, stress, and distraction, contributing to accidents. Fire, smoke, and soot create invisible hierarchies. Middle-class districts may enjoy cleaner air, less exposure to industrial emissions, and safer housing. The working class, situated near factories or along polluted streets, absorbs the brunt of these hazards. Geography determines risk. The closer to the furnaces, the greater the exposure, the higher the likelihood of chronic illness, injury, or early death. For children, hazards are immediate and long-lasting. Playing near streets coated in soot or near factories where sparks fly is common. Curiosity and necessity collide with danger. Accidental burns, smoke inhalation, and respiratory distress are ordinary events. Schools attempt to educate children about health, but the environment itself is often the primary teacher, sometimes cruelly so. Even awareness does not guarantee survival. Knowledge of hazards informs caution but does not eliminate risk. Families may avoid certain areas or times of day, but economic necessity often overrides safety. Work, food, and shelter demand proximity to the very sources of danger. Adaptation is a survival strategy, but it is never complete. And so, life in Victorian cities is lived in a fog, literally and metaphorically. Smoke blackens skin and lungs, fire threatens structures and lives, and soot accumulates on every surface. Endurance becomes both a physical skill and a cultural expectation. People learn to breathe around danger, to recognize signs of illness, to move carefully in spaces where flames, fumes, and ash are constant companions. Yet in the heart of this industrial haze, a question persists, quiet but persistent. If the air you breathe, the walls that surround you, and the work you depend upon are themselves dangerous, how do you measure safety, and what does survival even mean in such a world? By the middle of the Victorian era, exposure to fire, smoke, and soot has become routine, but it does not lose its cost. The hazards of urban industrial life accumulate slowly, invisibly, and relentlessly, leaving marks on bodies, habits, and entire communities. Breathing is never neutral. Coal smoke, cotton dust, and chemical fumes settle in the lungs, eyes, and throats of workers and residents alike. Coughing is ordinary, wheezing is familiar. By age 30, many working-class adults carry the cumulative burden of decades of exposure. Their endurance is remarkable, yet their bodies are compromised. Lung capacity diminished, immunity weakened, and susceptibility to disease heightened. Respiratory illness, bronchitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis is a constant presence, exacerbated by overcrowded housing and poor nutrition. Accidents are inevitable. Fires erupt in workshops, warehouses, and homes with alarming regularity. Factory floors slick with oil or textile dust become deadly. Sparks leap from furnaces into nearby wooden beams or stacks of flammable materials. Even brief lapses in attention can trigger devastation. Emergency response is slow, equipment rudimentary, and escape routes constrained. Families watch neighbors lose homes and lives, internalizing the constant fragility of their surroundings. Children are uniquely vulnerable. Playgrounds overlap with industrial spaces. Alleyways near mills, rooftops, or streets where sparks or chemicals may be present. Curiosity and necessity collide with danger. Burns, cuts, smoke inhalation, and chronic respiratory issues are everyday risks. Childhood is a negotiation between curiosity, survival, and instruction, learning which areas are off-limits, which fires are dangerous, which smoke is harmful, often through trial and error. Soot settles not only on surfaces but in routines. Clothing, bedding, walls, and hair remain perpetually marked by black residue. Laundry is frequent but incomplete. Washing can remove visible soot but not microscopic particles. Families adapt with layered clothing, repeated scrubbing, and careful handling of food and bedding, yet exposure is unavoidable. Homes themselves, even when tidy, are reservoirs of industrial dust. Chemical hazards add complexity. Lead, arsenic, and other compounds are present in dye works, printing factories, and metal shops. Skin irritation, hair loss, and eye damage are common. Prolonged exposure leads to neurological and systemic effects. Women and children performing secondary labor, sorting, cleaning, or packaging are disproportionately affected, often without awareness of the long-term consequences. Work intensifies exposure. Those in factories or near industrial processes are not only inhaling soot and dust, but navigating heat, noise, and vibration simultaneously. Fatigue exacerbates risk. Injuries, burns, cuts, fractures are common and often untreated, leaving lasting disability. Those who survive early accidents continue laboring, bodies weakened yet still necessary for family income. The urban environment magnifies danger. Narrow streets funnel smoke from multiple chimneys. Row houses trap heat and fumes, creating microclimates of pollution. Waterways are polluted, carrying chemical residues into daily life. Public health measures are emerging, but implementation is slow. For many, avoidance is impossible. Proximity to industry defines residence, work, and survival. Despite these hazards, adaptation emerges. Families develop routines, sweeping surfaces, covering beds and food, ventilating rooms when possible, and using protective cloths during work. Awareness of chemical and fire risks leads to small behavioral innovations, keeping children away from certain areas, storing flammable materials carefully, and improvising protective clothing. Yet these are mitigations, not solutions. Exposure continues. Smoke and fire shape perception. People normalize constant irritation of eyes, throats, and skin. Coughing becomes background noise. Occasional burns are expected. Children grow up accepting soot-stained clothes, blackened walls, and the threat of fire as ordinary conditions. Bodies endure, adapt, and scar, but memory persists. Every cough, every burn, every fire leaves psychological traces alongside physical ones. The cumulative effect is a subtle tyranny. Life is defined by what can be tolerated rather than what can be enjoyed. Health is measured in resilience rather than vitality. Children learn to navigate danger early. Adults negotiate it daily. The elderly bear the long-term consequences of decades of exposure. Community networks, informal advice, and neighborhood knowledge become as crucial to survival as any physical adaptation. And in this perpetual fog of dust, heat, and flame, one lingering question remains. If daily life requires constant exposure to hazards that erode both body and spirit, at what point does endurance become a quiet surrender rather than triumph? By the late Victorian era, the smoke-filled skylines of industrial cities begin to face scrutiny. Reformers, public health advocates, and investigative journalists document conditions with growing precision. Coal smoke is linked to chronic illness. Fires are recognized as preventable tragedies. Chemical exposure is increasingly understood. The hazards that were once accepted as inevitable slowly enter public debate. Legislation begins to address the worst excesses. Factory acts mandate basic safety measures, fire escapes, ventilated spaces, and limits on dangerous child labor. Local authorities enforce smoke abatement regulations, though unevenly. Chimneys are fitted with better flues. Street cleaning and refuse removal improve gradually. Public health boards begin monitoring industrial pollutants. Change is slow and inconsistent, but it signals the start of a new understanding that life and labor need not exist in constant hazard. Yet reform arrives unevenly. Wealthier districts benefit first: wider streets, cleaner water, and less pollution. Working-class neighborhoods, often closest to factories, remain the most exposed. Smoke still coats walls, streets, and lungs. Fires still erupt. Chemical contamination continues. Improvement is incremental, leaving many families to endure decades of accumulated damage before any meaningful relief is felt. Bodies bear the legacy. Workers in their 40s and 50s show years of wear: blackened lungs, persistent coughs, joint pain, and fatigue. Children who grew up in industrial neighborhoods carry stunted growth and early respiratory vulnerability. Life expectancy remains lower than in less polluted districts. Soot, dust, and chemical exposure leave invisible scars, shaping health outcomes across generations. Despite the hazards, communities persist. Knowledge of risk is passed down: which water pumps are safest, how to handle chemicals, how to avoid fire hazards. Families and neighbors form informal support networks to share food, advice, and protection. Endurance becomes both a necessity and a skill, taught silently alongside survival strategies. Adaptation is cultural as much as it is physical. Workers themselves negotiate a complex relationship with industry. Labor provides income, sustains families, and defines social identity. Yet it also exposes them to invisible dangers. Survival becomes a constant negotiation: how long to stay near the furnaces, how to balance income with exposure, how to care for children while avoiding contamination. Everyday choices are shaped by an intimate understanding of hazard. Children growing up in these neighborhoods develop resilience but also expectation. They learn that illness, injury, and soot are ordinary companions. Education often takes a backseat to labor or survival, yet informal knowledge about danger, hygiene, and endurance becomes a curriculum of necessity. They inherit lessons about vigilance, adaptation, and community solidarity. Industrial hazards also shape perception and culture. Smoke and soot are normalized. Chronic illness is expected. Fire is feared but familiar. This environment cultivates a quiet pragmatism. Triumph is measured not by wealth or comfort but by the ability to endure another day, to navigate invisible threats, and to protect oneself and family as best as possible. And as you walk the streets of a Victorian industrial city, noticing the blackened buildings, the chimneys that puff endlessly, and the worn faces of workers, a final reflection emerges. If life is lived amid smoke, flame, and chemical haze, and survival itself is the measure of achievement, how does that experience shape the generations that follow and the very idea of what it means to be healthy, safe, and alive? Story 7. Food, Famine, and the Daily Struggle: Diet and Survival in Victorian England. In Victorian England, hunger is rarely absolute, yet it is a constant presence. Meals are shaped by availability, cost, and season. For the working class, what you eat is dictated less by taste and more by survival, by how far your wages stretch, how much food you can buy, and how efficiently you can make it last. Breakfast is simple, often bread or porridge, sometimes thin and watery. Milk is a luxury, eggs even more so. Children may leave home with a small piece of bread or none at all, already facing hours of labor before their next opportunity to eat. Energy is rationed, measured, and distributed carefully among household members. Lunch is often taken at the workplace, especially for adults in factories, workshops, or markets. Packed meals are modest: a sandwich, some cold meat if affordable, or a piece of bread with cheese. For those without time or means, the midday meal may be skipped entirely. Hunger is learned as a routine state, and the body adapts, though slowly, to sustain deficiency. Dinner, sometimes the only substantial meal, is a delicate balance between quantity and cost. Families plan purchases based on weekly wages: potatoes, cabbage, occasionally meat or fish, and perhaps a small treat if money allows. Leftovers are prized. Nothing is wasted. Vegetables are boiled repeatedly, meat is stretched thin, and soups are made from scraps. Flavor is secondary to calories and satiety. Food scarcity is seasonal. Winter increases fuel costs, reduces vegetable variety, and stretches household budgets. Summer can be precarious too. Spoilage occurs quickly without refrigeration, and foodborne illness threatens the household. Markets fluctuate with crop yields, transport reliability, and economic conditions, making purchasing decisions an ongoing calculation of risk and reward. Famine, though not constant, is never unimaginable. Crop failures, poor harvests, and economic downturns translate immediately into hunger for the urban poor. Families may experience acute shortages for weeks at a time. Children grow up acutely aware of scarcity, learning to value every morsel and to recognize signs of impending shortage. Adults develop strategies to stretch provisions, buying cheaper grains, scavenging leftovers, or supplementing diets with foraged greens or cheap preserved foods. Nutrition is uneven, yet life persists. Meals may lack protein or fat, resulting in stunted growth and increased vulnerability to disease. Vitamin deficiencies are common. Scurvy, rickets, and anemia appear frequently among children and adults. These conditions are often invisible to outsiders, yet their impact is profound, affecting energy, strength, and resilience. Labor shapes diet profoundly. Long working hours demand caloric intake, yet insufficient wages limit availability. Heavy labor combined with poor nutrition creates a cycle of fatigue, illness, and diminished productivity. Those who are malnourished are more susceptible to injury and disease, yet cannot afford to reduce work. Survival is a constant balancing act between energy intake and expenditure. Women manage scarcity with skill and endurance. They are responsible for rationing meals, cooking, and ensuring children receive enough to survive. Creativity is essential. Soup stretched with water, bread baked from every leftover grain, small amounts of fat or sugar conserved carefully. Efficiency is a survival skill, learned through necessity and refined over years. Children adapt in ways that are both practical and insidious. They learn to eat quickly, to be satisfied with minimal portions, to hide treats, and to negotiate for food. Play, growth, and concentration are all tempered by scarcity. Hunger is normalized, not necessarily as suffering, but as routine, a background condition shaping behavior, expectation, and health. Even in the absence of famine, the question of survival dominates life. Every purchase, every meal, every morsel is weighed against potential scarcity, labor demands, and the health of family members. Economic, social, and seasonal factors converge to create a precarious daily calculus. And so, in the dim kitchens, over boiling pots, and around worn tables, one persistent question lingers in the mind of every Victorian household struggling with food. When sustenance is never guaranteed, and survival depends on constant calculation and compromise, how does hunger shape not only the body, but the expectations, habits, and imagination of those who endure it? Hunger is constant, but human ingenuity is relentless. Families in Victorian England develop elaborate strategies to stretch scarce resources, turning scarcity into a form of skillful management. Every penny, every bite, every scrap is accounted for. Survival becomes a game of anticipation, adaptation, and compromise. Markets are navigated with precision. Housewives and working men learn which stalls offer slightly fresher bread, cheaper vegetables, or discounted meat. They time visits to coincide with price drops or waste sales. Some scavenge what others discard: bruised fruit, leftover grains, or scraps of meat. Nothing is truly wasted. Every potential morsel is evaluated for edibility, nutrition, and safety. Cooking is an exercise in alchemy. Watered-down soups, stretched stews, and bread baked from mixed flours are common. Bones are boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition. Fat, sugar, and milk luxuries for many are carefully conserved and doled out. Even the act of heating food requires negotiation. Coal is expensive, stoves are inefficient, and fuel consumption must balance warmth, cooking needs, and cost. Children are enlisted in survival strategies. They fetch water, collect coal, or help gather food scraps. They learn to identify edible weeds, to avoid spoiled meat, and to recognize the signs of illness caused by malnutrition. Play is often intertwined with labor. Games in alleys involve collecting items useful for meals or household chores. Childhood innocence is partially sacrificed to the necessity of sustaining life. Labor determines diet as much as scarcity. Heavy industrial work or domestic labor demands calories, yet wages rarely allow for sufficient nutrition. Adults ration food to preserve energy for work, sometimes eating smaller portions themselves to allow children or spouses more sustenance. The physical toll is subtle but cumulative. Fatigue, weakness, and slower recovery from illness become routine experiences. Malnutrition affects more than the body. It shapes the mind and social behavior. Children may struggle with concentration in school or work. Adults may experience irritability or depression, and families make difficult choices about who receives nourishment first. Social hierarchy within the household becomes partially determined by perceived need, strength, and contribution to survival. Famine and scarcity heighten ingenuity. Families preserve foods for months, pickling vegetables, salting meat, or drying bread. Gardens, even tiny backyard plots or windowsills, provide supplemental nutrition. Foraging becomes an accepted, though sometimes risky, practice. Streets, canals, and commons serve as sources of wild greens, eggs, and fish. Risk is constantly balanced against potential reward. Community networks also play a vital role. Neighbors share surplus food when possible, exchange cooking tips, or pool resources to buy in bulk. Mutual aid societies and charitable kitchens provide temporary relief during shortages. These social structures are fragile, yet they amplify survival strategies, creating a buffer against catastrophe. The urban poor constantly negotiate compromise. A single unexpected event, a sudden illness, a factory closure, or a price spike can tip the balance from subsistence to crisis. Families must maintain flexibility, adjusting meals, substituting ingredients, or temporarily reducing portions. The mental load of these calculations is immense, yet it becomes invisible over time, accepted as ordinary life. Seasonal cycles define scarcity and abundance. Winter is hardest, fuel is needed for warmth, vegetables are limited and prices rise. Summer brings some relief. Gardens provide produce, markets overflow with seasonal goods, and fishing or foraging supplements diets. Yet even abundance is measured carefully. Nothing is guaranteed to last, and preparation for scarcity is always ongoing. Nutrition and health are intimately connected. Weakness from hunger makes individuals more susceptible to disease, injury, and death. Conversely, illness reduces the ability to work and earn, creating a feedback loop of vulnerability. Survival is rarely heroic, it is pragmatic, requiring constant attention, sacrifice, and adaptation. Through these strategies, families endure. They ration, scavenge, cook creatively, and share resources. They learn patterns of risk and opportunity, mastering survival in conditions that would overwhelm outsiders. Life persists in small victories: a child's growth despite limited food, a household managing to stretch coal and vegetables across the week, or a neighbor sharing just enough to avert a crisis. And yet, the shadow of scarcity never fully lifts. Even in times of apparent plenty, the memory of hunger shapes decisions, behavior, and expectation. It becomes embedded in culture, family practices, and personal psychology. The daily struggle with food is a teacher as relentless as any factory or disease. One question lingers in every household, pressing like the weight of an empty pot. If survival requires constant calculation, compromise, and sacrifice, how does that shape not only the body, but the imagination, ambition, and sense of possibility for those who live it? By the late Victorian era, some progress begins to ease the relentless pressure of food scarcity. but it is uneven and fragile. Agricultural advances, improved transportation, and emerging charitable initiatives provide relief for some, while the poorest households remain vulnerable to hunger, malnutrition, and its consequences. Markets slowly stabilize as railways and canals improve the flow of food from rural areas to cities. Fresh vegetables, meat, and dairy become more widely available, reducing but not eliminating the risk of famine. Urban grocers stock a greater variety of goods, and the growth of cooperative societies allows families to purchase essentials at slightly lower cost. These improvements make survival slightly less precarious, yet the habits and lessons of scarcity remain ingrained. Nutrition education begins to emerge, often through charities, schools, and early public health campaigns. Mothers are taught the importance of balanced diets for children, even if the means to achieve it are limited. Guidance on food hygiene, preparation, and storage helps reduce disease risk. Yet practical constraints, money, fuel, labor, and space continue to dictate the realities of daily meals. Survival remains a negotiation rather than a guarantee. Charitable kitchens, soup distributions, and workhouse relief offer emergency support during crises such as poor harvests or industrial strikes. These interventions save lives, but they are temporary and often carry social stigma. Families may avoid seeking help until desperation forces them, balancing survival against shame. The ability to endure without aid becomes a mark of dignity and resilience, even when the cost is severe. Even with these incremental improvements, malnutrition continues to affect health. Stunted growth, anemia, weakened immunity, and chronic fatigue persist in urban populations. Children born into poor families carry the nutritional legacy of their parents' deprivation. Physical endurance, cognitive development, and long-term well-being are all shaped by the persistent presence of scarcity. Yet alongside suffering, the human capacity for adaptation is remarkable. Households develop routines and strategies to cope with scarcity, stretching ingredients, preserving food, and teaching children to value what little they have. These practices, learned over generations, form an invisible curriculum of survival, blending pragmatism, creativity, and endurance. The act of surviving under scarcity is itself a kind of skill. Community networks amplify resilience. Neighbors exchange small quantities of food, advise on market prices, or share knowledge of safe water and storage techniques. Local charities, churches, and philanthropic societies provide support during acute shortages. These networks function as informal insurance, spreading risk and offering a measure of security. Solidarity becomes a resource as vital as money or calories. Work, diet, and health remain intimately intertwined. Labor demands calories, yet wages limit access. Illness reduces the ability to work, and scarcity magnifies vulnerability. Every decision about what to eat, when to work, and how to conserve energy becomes part of an ongoing calculus, shaping not only survival but rhythm, behavior, and expectation. Life is a constant negotiation with material limits. In households that endure, small victories are significant. A child reaching school age healthy enough to attend daily, a week's worth of meals successfully rationed, or a neighborly exchange that averts immediate hunger. These are triumphs born of diligence, observation, and adaptation. Survival is rarely heroic in appearance, but it is sustained and deliberate, demanding skill, endurance, and cooperation. Even as material conditions slowly improve, the psychological and cultural imprint of scarcity persists. Families remain cautious, budgeting tightly, hoarding essentials, and teaching children to value what they have. Scarcity becomes a lens through which life is experienced. Meals are measured, waste is unacceptable, and preparedness is constant. Hunger shapes not only the body but expectations, imagination, and ambition. And in the quiet of kitchens, at tables cluttered with meager meals, one reflection remains, lingering and persistent. If survival is measured in small, daily victories rather than abundance, how does the constant presence of scarcity shape not only bodies and health, but the very aspirations and dreams of those who endure it. Story 8: Childhood on the Edge, Growing Up in the Shadows of Poverty. In Victorian England, childhood is often a precarious stage of life, defined less by play and discovery than by survival, labor, and adaptation. For the urban poor, streets, workshops, and cramped homes serve as classrooms for endurance, vigilance, and negotiation with constant risk. From the moment a child is born, the environment shapes body, mind, and expectation. Infant mortality is high. Cramped housing, poor sanitation, limited nutrition, and exposure to disease make survival uncertain. Families grow accustomed to loss. Grief becomes practical, measured, and often silent. Mothers carry not only the physical toll of childbirth but the psychological weight of knowing that not all children may survive. The first months of life are crucial, and every precaution, bottles boiled, water filtered, bedding changed, is an act of vigilance. Children live amid hazards that are invisible and ubiquitous. Smoke from coal fires coats lungs and skin, soot settles on bedding, chemical residues from nearby workshops contaminate surfaces. Streets teem with traffic, horses, carts, and pedestrians collide in narrow lanes. Factories buzz with noise and machinery, threatening limbs and lives. Play, when it occurs, is entwined with risk. Curiosity and necessity collide. Children fetch water, collect coal, or run errands for wages, learning to navigate danger long before adulthood. Labor begins early. By age 7 or 8, many children work in factories, workshops, or domestic service. Hours are long, tasks are repetitive, dangerous, and exhausting. Child labor is seen as necessary both economically and socially. Families rely on income, and society treats work as a form of moral and practical training. Education, when accessible, competes with labor. Even where schools exist, attendance may be irregular, disrupted by illness, weather, or family need. Nutrition shapes development from the earliest days. Meals are often meager, lacking protein, fat, or fresh vegetables. Hunger is routine. Malnutrition affects growth, energy, and resistance to disease. Children endure chronic fatigue, stunted development, and illness as part of everyday life. Those who survive early adversity carry its physical and psychological imprint into adolescence. Play exists, but always alongside responsibility. Games are improvised in alleys, courtyards, or streets, often incorporating labor tasks, collecting scrap materials, foraging, or running messages. Physical risk accompanies enjoyment, yet these moments foster ingenuity, coordination, and social negotiation. Social hierarchies form early. Stronger, faster, or smarter children navigate both survival and status among peers. Family networks provide guidance and protection, though resources are strained. Older siblings care for younger ones. Mothers multitask between labor, household chores, and caregiving. Fathers may be absent due to work or illness. Instruction is often practical. How to avoid fire, identify edible plants, handle tools, or care for the sick. Knowledge is learned experientially, through observation and trial, not formal education. Neighborhoods serve as extensions of the household. Streets, alleys, and workshops form social networks where information about danger, employment, and scarcity circulates. Children learn quickly which areas are safe, which neighbors can be trusted, and which hazards are immediate threats. Observation and memory are survival skills, as vital as strength or agility. Disease looms constantly. Sickness is part of everyday experience. Coughs, fevers, rashes, and injuries are normalized. Families respond with care and improvisation, isolating the ill when possible, boiling water, or seeking aid from charity hospitals or local doctors. Yet vulnerability is high, and mortality is an ever-present specter. Childhood is a stage of precarity, endurance, and adaptation. Curiosity, play, and growth are constrained by poverty, labor, and risk. Children learn to negotiate scarcity, to anticipate danger, and to contribute to the survival of family and community. Resilience is cultivated early, often at the cost of health, comfort, and innocence. And as these young lives unfold amid soot, noise, hunger, and disease. A persistent, unspoken question hovers. If survival is learned before play, vigilance before curiosity, and labor before education, what kind of life does a child inherit from the shadows of poverty? For children growing up in Victorian cities, survival is a curriculum taught in alleys, workshops, and cramped homes. Every day reinforces lessons in vigilance, resourcefulness, and endurance. Play and education exist, but they are secondary to the pressing realities of hunger, labor, and risk. Work dominates daily life for many. Factory floors, workshops, and domestic households demand hours of attention, strength, and skill from children. Tasks are repetitive, dangerous, and often physically taxing, tending machines, hauling goods, or cleaning. Injuries, cuts, burns, bruises are common and treated minimally. The expectation is not only to endure pain but to remain productive despite it. Hunger shapes behavior and learning. Meals are rationed, portions are small, nutritional deficits are common. Children develop strategies, eating quickly, hiding small morsels, or negotiating for extra food. Malnutrition leaves lasting effects: stunted growth, fatigue, vulnerability to disease, and delayed cognitive development. Yet adaptation is remarkable. The body learns to conserve energy, focus on immediate needs, and tolerate deficiency as ordinary. Neighborhoods are extensions of school and home. Streets serve as arenas of both danger and education. Children observe patterns of illness, learn which areas are safe, which neighbors offer aid, and which hazards to avoid. Curiosity is guided by necessity. A shortcut may save time but expose one to fire, theft, or polluted water. Memory and attention to detail become survival skills, honed through repetition. Social hierarchies are internalized early. Stronger, faster, or more cunning children often rise in local peer networks. Older siblings assume caregiving roles, mediating disputes, sharing knowledge, and protecting younger ones. Authority is often negotiated rather than imposed. Lessons are learned through observation, imitation, and practical consequence. Respect and cooperation are survival tools. Health lessons are experiential. Families teach children how to treat minor injuries, identify early signs of illness, and manage chronic conditions. Diseases like cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis are ever-present threats. Isolation, boiling water, and careful hygiene, though limited, become part of daily routine. Knowledge of risk is as critical as physical strength in navigating childhood. Play and imagination persist, but often with pragmatism. Games are intertwined with chores or labor tasks, collecting fuel, scavenging materials, or running errands. Play teaches agility, coordination, and strategy, but is framed by the boundaries of safety, social rules, and available resources. Imagination thrives within constraint, creating worlds that reflect both danger and resilience. Education, when accessible, is intermittent. Schools provide literacy and numeracy, but attendance is inconsistent due to illness, labor, or weather. Lessons from textbooks coexist with lessons from life. Practical arithmetic in the marketplace, literacy for wage calculations, or reading street signs and social cues for survival. Knowledge is both formal and lived. Children also internalize emotional resilience. Loss, injury, and hardship are regular companions. Grief, fear, and disappointment are processed silently, taught as part of growing up. Empathy is tempered by practicality. Helping a sick sibling is both necessary and morally instructive, yet resources may limit what is possible. Emotional maturity is accelerated by circumstance. Neighborhoods form informal safety nets. Kin and neighbors share advice, care for younger children, and provide small resources. Charity institutions, schools, workhouses, or mission halls offer temporary respite, supplementing family strategies. Social observation becomes crucial. Knowing whom to trust, when to accept aid, and how to maintain independence are learned lessons in negotiation. By adolescence, children have mastered survival skills that outsiders rarely recognize. They navigate work, illness, hunger, danger, and social networks with competence born of necessity. Adaptation is practical, learned through experience and reinforced daily. Childhood is defined not by freedom, but by the constant negotiation of constraints. And as these young lives unfold amid labor, scarcity, and risk, the persistent question remains. If a child's education is survival and play is filtered through danger, how do these lessons shape identity, ambition, and the expectations of life that lie ahead? By the late Victorian era, some opportunities begin to alter the harsh trajectory of childhood for the urban poor, yet the shadows of early life remain long and influential. Reforms, education, and modest improvements in public health slowly change conditions, but children who grow up amid scarcity, labor, and disease carry both physical and psychological legacies into adulthood. Schooling, where accessible, offers more than literacy and numeracy. It provides exposure to ideas beyond survival, reading about distant places, science, history, and moral instruction. For some children, these experiences plant seeds of aspiration, yet attendance is often irregular, interrupted by illness, family obligations, or seasonal work. The promise of education competes constantly with necessity. Workhouses and charitable programs supplement family resources. They provide food, shelter, and basic instruction, often under strict rules and harsh conditions. While these institutions may reduce immediate danger, they rarely compensate fully for the deprivation experienced at home. Still, they demonstrate the first glimmers of structured support outside the family unit, offering children both relief and exposure to social organization. Labor continues, but reforms begin to limit exploitation. Factory acts regulate child labor hours, enforce minimum age requirements, and, in some cases, improve working conditions. Children retain responsibilities, yet the burden begins to lighten slightly. This slow progress alters life trajectories. Less time in dangerous labor allows for schooling, rest, and some leisure, laying groundwork for healthier adulthood. Nutrition, though still limited, improves incrementally. Charitable kitchens, cooperative societies, and better food distribution help families stretch their resources. Awareness of the importance of balanced diets grows, and some mothers adopt emerging knowledge of hygiene and nutrition. Incremental gains in health and growth are visible, though generational effects of early deprivation persist. Resilience, cultivated over years of hardship, becomes both a skill and a psychological framework. Children who survived repeated illness, injury, and scarcity demonstrate adaptability, problem-solving, and vigilance. These qualities, honed in precarious childhoods, become tools for navigating adulthood, work, and family responsibilities. Yet they also carry cost. Early endurance leaves bodies weakened, health compromised, and expectations tempered by prior deprivation. Neighborhoods continue to teach survival. Peer networks, informal mentorship, and local knowledge remain crucial. Older children care for younger ones, friends provide advice, and communities share resources. These social lessons complement formal education, creating a dual system of instruction, one learned in books, the other in the streets and alleys. Psychologically, early exposure to risk, loss, and scarcity shapes identity. Ambition is filtered through realism. Dreams must be compatible with survival, creativity constrained by circumstance, and social mobility understood as difficult, rare, and often contingent on luck or extraordinary effort. Yet within these constraints, agency persists. Small achievements, incremental progress, and everyday triumphs define meaningful life. Even as material conditions improve, memories of scarcity persist. Adults retain vigilance, habits of frugality, and adaptive strategies learned in childhood. Parents teach these lessons to their own children, creating a continuity of knowledge shaped by necessity. Survival itself becomes a cultural inheritance, as influential as genes or formal education. The enduring lesson of childhood on the edge is subtle but profound. Strength is forged in adversity. Skill is cultivated in scarcity. Empathy emerges alongside hardship. Life is defined by the ability to endure, adapt, and navigate both human and environmental hazards. Childhood is not merely a stage of innocence or play, it is the crucible in which resilience, resourcefulness, and cautious optimism are tempered. And as you reflect on these lives, one question lingers with quiet insistence. If the first lessons a child learns are about danger, scarcity, and endurance, how do those lessons shape not only the trajectory of a single life, but the culture, expectations, and resilience of an entire generation?